Good evening. So nice to see all of you and in person. My name is Nicole Watson. I'm the gallery director here at the Catherine G. Murphy Gallery. Welcome to tonight's Artist Talk by Sarah Kusa. She'll discuss the work on view in her current exhibition, Containment Strategies, which is on view in our East Gallery space. I'd like to begin tonight's event by recognizing that St. Catherine University is on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people, specifically the Wahapkuti and the Oceti-Sakowin. The Dakota people are still here. They continue to live, love, and thrive on this land. We offer our honor and respect to the Dakota people and to this land, and we know we must challenge ourselves to also take action. But what does action mean, especially for institutions like St. Kate's? In his recent hyperallergic opinion piece titled "A Land Acknowledgement is Not Enough," scholar Joseph M. Pierce outlines what action can look like. Pierce, an assistant professor in the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature at Stony Brook University and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, writes, quote, "Land does not require that you confirm it exists, but that you reciprocate the care it has given you. Land is not asking for acknowledgement, it is asking to be returned to itself. It is asking to be heard and cared for and attended to. It is asking to be free. Land is not an object, not a thing. Land does not require recognition, it requires care, it requires presence. Land is a gift, a relative, a body that sustains other bodies. And if the land is our relative, then we cannot simply acknowledge it as land. We must understand what our responsibilities are to this land as our kin. To engage with the land on the land's terms is an act of reciprocity. Reciprocity, rather than recognition, is what the land requires, because that is what the land has already given. Are you not alive, breathing, because of the land?" Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So just like, so his name is Joseph Pierce. He was writing an article for Hyperallergic, and someone sent it to me today, and I thought, like, when we're thinking about land acknowledgements, right, they're really complex things. But I really liked thinking about it in this framework. I thought it was really powerful. So I'm sharing it with all of you. We can process it together. So thanks for letting me read that too. Thank you for joining us for tonight's event. So I'm going to give you a little housekeeping. Sarah's going to talk for like 20 or so minutes, and then she'll take some questions. And then we should have time if you want to pop out into the gallery space and just take a look at the exhibition. I'm sure Sarah would be willing to chat with people out there too after she's done. I want to mention that tonight's Artist Talk event is part of Twin Cities Art Week, which is a celebration of the vibrant local contemporary art scene in 24 venues across Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there's a lot happening between now and Sunday. We have some brochures out in the lobby space if you're curious about other things that are happening. We were really honored to be included in the activities this week, and it's a great time to get out and look at art. So make sure you do some of that this weekend, especially students if you're on fall break. Okay, so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to Sarah Kusa. I'm going to read you a bio that she provided to me. She is a Minnesota-based visual artist who creates mixed media sculpture and installations dealing with themes of human vulnerability and interconnection, with forms ranging from abstract bodies to three-dimensional drawings in space. Materials and gestures are central to her work. Sarah has exhibited her art throughout the United States and is the recipient of a 2021 McKnight Fellowship in Fiber Arts, a 2017-2018 Jerome Foundation Fellowship for Early Career Artists, a 2015 Jerome Foundation Project Grant, and a 2012 McKnight Next Step Fund. She has participated in residencies at Mass MoCA, Ragdale, and the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota. And she lives and works here in St. Paul. So please join me in welcoming Sarah to the podium. Thank you all for coming out on this dark and blustery night. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you, Nicole, for that incredibly kind introduction. And I also would like to just say thank you to St. Catherine University for the chance to have my art here as part of
their really incredible visual art program. And also offer my thanks to Twin Cities Art Week for having me on board, as well as the McKnight Foundation for making much of this work possible in the last couple of years. And so what I'd love to do tonight is to just set the stage for the work in the adjacent gallery and show you a little bit of what is some of my thinking behind it, what was some of the work that was leading up to it, and what does that look like to put together in terms of process. And so, can everyone hear me okay? Even in the back? Okay, super. Let me know if that changes. Some of the threads of my work, in general, so mostly I work in 3 dimensions, not always, but largely in sculpture and installation. And there's a few recurring ideas that circulate through my work and have for the last 5+ years. And so some of those are human vulnerability, both in our bodies and in our minds, how human vulnerability and power interact, and some of the questions that come up with that, and barriers and boundaries that we make to compensate for those vulnerabilities, whether they're like actual physical barriers that we erect, or whether they're sort of lines that we draw in our mind between us and other people. And there's about 3 works that I'd like to show you from my archive that kind of typify that and set the stage for what's in the adjacent gallery. This is Chambers from 2018, and it's made of torn used bed sheets. And this is something that fits a body in either of the 3 compartments, and is probably the first example really of the grid in my work recently. Oop, that's too fast. Okay, this is a piece from 2017 called Barrier, Keep Out, Stay In. And I would consider this really like a 3-dimensional drawing. It's a very immediate process. So it was kind of a complicated image in terms of the perspective, but basically it's a piece that's anchored to the wall, and then you can walk around this end that's closer to you. It's essentially an intervention in the space where there's a side that kind of makes you feel penned in, and then there's a side that you can walk around and feel like you're outside a limit set for someone else. And that's one of the first works that I was doing where I was thinking about containment. And then this piece is from further back, from 2015, and it's called Force Field. And if you look really closely, you can see, especially at the floor in this image, there's some very almost invisible silver threads that are just threaded through again and again. And with this work, I was thinking about, it was probably the first work that I've made where I was thinking about protection from something abstract, from something that might not be visible, from something that maybe was only aware to a person in their own mind. And thinking also about the possible futility of trying to contain something like that. This is not my work, but this is the work of Franz Klein. Let me see if I can make that. A lot of these disappear. Okay, not gonna worry about that. But I wanted to share a few artists that have influenced the way that I think, and kind of some of the ingredients that go into my work in terms of artists that I admire, or that there are things in their practice or their work that I admire. And so for Franz Klein, he was one of the first artists that made a big impression on me for the power of gesture. And basically one of the things that I admire about his work is the economy of it, in terms of how he's able to do quite a lot with just a little bit, in terms of a minimal color palette and gesture, and what that's able to do. Then another artist that I look to is Eva Hesse. And so with Eva, it's her materials that relate, I think, really well to the body. Also materials that are vulnerable in some way, that have irregularity, that have the possibility that they could be damaged. And that's one of the things that I love about her work. Fred Sandback is an artist I didn't know about until a few years ago. His work takes basically really simple yarn and creates drawings in space, or interventions in spaces that make the body have to interact with them in some way. And so his work is something that I admire for the reaction that it requires of a human body. And then lastly, Louise Bourgeois. She was not one of the first artists that I was drawn to, but the longer that I've been working as an artist, the more I appreciate how broad her practice was, from printmaking and painting to large and small sculpture and more. And so I admire that breadth, as well as the way that she really made emotionally powerful work. So if you took a splash of all four of those artists and kind of stirred them up, some of those ingredients are things that I'm trying to incorporate into my work. And so in the past 3 years, I would say, my ideas have shifted, or I suppose more accurately, I'd say focused a little bit more. So still, I have the recurring ideas that crop up in all of my work, but lately, just before the pandemic, and especially during, my ideas have kind of focused in on anxiety, both my own and shared anxiety that we have collectively together. Wondering, can we contain the things that we're afraid of, or that we are worried about, as a way of coping? What happens if that container itself is vulnerable? And visually, like having a language of physical restrictions, cages, and especially grids. So I've been working with the grid for a little while, and just thinking about grids, for me, the grid is one of the simplest forms of a barrier that I notice. And also for me, probably because my first language as an artist is in textiles and fibers, whenever I see a grid, whether it's made out of fiber or not, or whether it's woven or not, I always see it as a woven form, or a reference to the woven form. And in thinking about grids, another artist comes up, Sol LeWitt, and his work is work that I've been thinking about during my exploration of grids. Modular work that can be kind of devised in a variety of ways. And so this is from 2019. This is basically, I started a series of grid studies about 3 years ago. And this one is called Slumped Grid. And with my grid studies, I was really interested in taking the grid, but making it not able to serve as something of containment, or taking away its containing power. And so this one is something that's kind of just barely standing up. It teeters and is about 4 feet, 3 or 4 feet tall, and was something that was just kind of in a vulnerable posture. And then these are some further grid studies that are made of Kozo paper and also craft paper with India ink and just pencil. And so these were laid out and cut as grid forms and then drawn on and just kind of hung up to be not rigid and you know, they're susceptible to flopping, tearing, again, not really able to contain. And then these are some studies on cut canvas. So just working with painter's canvas and acrylic and creating some sections of grid that way. And on the same kind of experimental note, this is a larger cut canvas piece where I created a cage and then collapsed it on itself and was curious to find out what happens when in the process of that containment failing. And so that has been happening for the last 2 to 3 years. And then this material showed up in my studio, this pink material. And if you've not ever cruised the aisles of hardware stores or Home Depot, you might not have run into this before. But this material is called Fanfold, and it's a building insulation that basically is a 1/4 inch thick, and it is meant to be used in building a shelter. It's meant to be sandwiched between a wall, so not visible from the interior, not visible from the exterior. It's typically used where it's the last layer put on before the outer surface goes on the wall. So it's protective, but only to a degree. And so I started down the path of experimenting with this material, initially interested in, you know, many of the qualities it had sculpturally, and started basically a series of terrible experiments with this material. So, ranging from, you know, probably the most egregious is bottom right, covering it with fake fur. Side note, don't cut fake fur unless you're wearing a mask. That's a terrible idea. But at first, I was having a recognition that this material was really sculpturally interesting, but was very bothered by the fact that there's factory printing on it. And so I'll pass these around in case you've wanted to touch the work in the gallery, or in case you want to touch it later, just to get an idea of what this is like. But it comes with this, you know, factory printing on it in red, pink panthers all across it. And that photo doesn't adequately show it, but that's what's on the back side of that material. And so I'll just send these around. Feel free to touch it and see what it's like. And really, so while I was experimenting with this material, some other things were going on. So I was still interested in failed containers, like this crushed trap at the upper right, or the idea of protective membranes at the bottom right. But also, this is when the pandemic set in. And so the image at the left-hand side is an image from the Wall Street Journal in in 2020 when, this is from Hunan province in China, when the animal trade was coming under scrutiny as a source of possible disease. And so this image got me thinking about separation and isolation, and it's in that context with that added layer of kind of environmental and circumstantial forces that this first cage was really born, that I've kind of been circling around. And so this hit in November for me of 2020, which is several months into the pandemic by then. I was not one of those artists who was looking to make work in response to the pandemic. And I was not an artist who had a ready response to the pandemic. There were a lot of people I knew who had things to put out in the world right away. In my case, I felt like I was a bird that had flown into a window, just kind of stunned and looking to get my bearings when that was happening. And so for me, I was not making work for about, from March 2020 until maybe September or October of 2020. I was really just taking everything in and trying to see if my work even made sense to me anymore, if it even felt like relevant to the questions I was having. And that's the context in which this form was born. And I think this was really an intuitive response to living in that time, that it really kind of cropped up in a form that was intuitive to what I was experiencing. And so these were some of my first experiments with those forms right after I had that recognition that I wanted to work with cages cut in that way. And I should say that in that process, I made peace with what this material actually is. It's insulation. It's meant to be a barrier, and that was how I needed to use it. I needed to not be covering, I needed to not be trying to disguise it for something else, because that's where its power was as a material. And so I started these experiments where I was leaving some of the factory printing visible, and then basically kind of color matching it and bringing in a painted element on about half of the other pieces. And so I knew that I wanted to make a lot of them. And so I just started cutting a bunch of cage forms. And this work was at first delightful. This material cuts really easily, and was a meditative process. I will say, like, over the course of time, became something of a punishment, and really something that challenged me, I'll say. So I knew that I was going for quite a thicket of them. I was interested in kind of approximating that sense of accumulation of time that felt like it was lost during the times that we were kind of sitting still during the pandemic. And so, yeah, I started making as many of these that I could. I figured out pretty quickly that I wasn't going to be able to make a giant installation in my studio, and my studio mate, who is here tonight, can attest that these took over the studio, and she was very gracious about that. but my working set of them was about 13, what you see on the left. And I only made the mistake once of gluing one of them together before I realized there was no way I was going to be able to have that many forms that were permanently at that scale. So with the exception of one, they all pinned together because it was my intention to make them so that they could be flat, travel somewhere, and then be put together. So you're welcome to look for the one that's glued together in the gallery. You might be able to find it. And so at this stage, I was really working with ways to arrange them to create that sense of accumulation and to create that sense of a jumble or a thicket and that density that I was looking for. And this is here at the gallery. This was my first opportunity to try this work at scale, at the scale that I'd imagined. And I was able to have a wonderfully long install window, which I'm grateful for. And so working here, it became a matter of really just finding that footprint and finding the way to create again, that sense of an overwhelming mass that I was looking for. And this process was pretty precarious. I definitely had cages topple on me at various points, trying to shift something slightly where one up high would maybe tumble down. And I like that precarity, though I'm the only one who experienced, I think, a cage falling directly on me. I like the idea that maybe that adds to the doubt that this could actually function to contain anything. So where the containers themselves are vulnerable and feel at risk in some way. And then figuring out how to light this was another thing that I played around a lot with. So in my studio, the daylight made for a really bright and crisp presentation of that work. Here in the gallery, I opted to go with low light, and particularly to have shadows, but have them not be overwhelming the work, but sort of expanding the work. And I think in the end, for me, that lighting feels like a sense of quiet and a sense of reverence for some of the heavier things that are in this work. The work gives off this sort of pink and almost happy glow, but underneath that, there is loneliness, there is grief related to, separation and isolation. And I think that low light allows for that to be kind of respected and for there to be some reverence around the heavy weight that's in there too. And yeah, with that, I'd love to have any questions that have cropped up in the meantime, if anything comes to mind that you'd like to know more about or that I spoke about too quickly. Yes?
The material that you found at Home Depot, was that a happen chance, or was it like presented to you and you needed to seek it out, finding that material?
Sure. I love to find art materials in home improvement situations or situations where they're not meant to be art materials. So that one was one that I that I just happened to walk past. I mean, on a mission for something else, probably home related. And I'd never seen it before. It was, you know, folded up, kind of, it collapses like an accordion book. And yeah, you can totally find it by the lumber and kind of that end of the store. But that was a total surprise. I hadn't seen it before, and I immediately had to buy one to see what it could do. And at first I was really convinced that I was going to use it standing up on its edge, because it was just frankly really fun to unfurl in that way. But yeah, in the end, it was something that I decided to cut into. Thank you. Yes.
In a couple of your earlier slides toward the beginning, well, I think it kind of culminated in when it said jumble or something. I was wondering about before I saw that one, if all of them were self-standing, where they kind of ended just it looked like just a string coming down, and there wasn't a wall or anything to attach it to, and then you showed one that was kind of falling down, so I wondered if that was a recurring thing, or?
Oh, of this work or earlier
No,
work?
it was earlier,
Okay.
yeah. Before this. There, that one.
Oh, this
When
one
you
here.
said it's, I don't know what words you used, but not stable, not very stable.
Yeah.
And so I wondered, first of all, does it stand up by itself? And then you had ones earlier that just ended like with a string coming down, and I couldn't see where it was attached.
Sure,
Just
sure.
made me wonder about, I don't know, how they were existing.
Sure. So this one did stand up by itself, but
It's impossible.
in a way that was just like, you know, kind of improbable. And actually, this one actually is made of fan-fold insulation underneath the paper mache. But that wetness of the paper mache was actually what caused it to sort of slump in on itself as it was drying. It kind of pulled it. And then with, let's see, I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. With, no, I was going the right way, sorry. With
This, yeah, oh, and one more back, yeah.
Yep.
This one,
So this one has, at
how does it?
these points here are attached to the wall.
Uh-huh.
Then there's a point down here that's attached into the floor. And then at the upper corner there's basically a clear
Oh,
line that
it is.
tethers it
Okay.
up out of the way, so like you wouldn't run into it as a viewer, but you can basically
So it's kind of
walk
meant to have that
around.
illusion that it's
Yeah.
not attached to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that one does have kind of a floating space feel to it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Sarah, I was just remembering I've given a lot of students tours of the show in the gallery, and they, something that they kind of hone in on right away is the red painted on the inside, and then of course the one structure that is the only red structure in this space. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of color in the work. The students seem really interested by that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that part of what I was looking for with using the material raw, like not covered up, was I was looking to express an intention around, yes, this is insulation, yes, this is what the material is. And basically the red was something that I chose as a color match to the factory printing, as a way for me to be able to use the factory printing as a visual element, but also have a way to insert some visual depth and some visual weight where where it might otherwise have felt really kind of light and floaty. And so that's where the painting of some of the interiors came from. And then, yeah, along the way, I had a suggestion from a friend to try one with the inside and outside painted. And at first I thought that was not my favorite idea. And in the end, the one that I created that way just had a compelling look to it that I needed to incorporate. And so that one feels visually heavier. And I wanted that one to be the one that can be walked under. I think we all intuitively know that this is lightweight, it's not actually gonna fall on you. But being able to walk under it and having that visual weight amplified by that color made it feel heavier in my mind. And so yeah, that's part of that color treatment. And then also my work often reflects back on the body. And I think this work is bodily, both in terms of the gesture that's visible with the drawing, the drawn lines, or the cutting, drawing by cutting, but also kind of thinking about the inner workings of our bodies, and sort of the pathways and the vessels and the sort of the pink and red that we might find on the inside as well.
Yeah, students pick up on that right away. Reminds them of vessels and veins, for brain pathways when I ask them what they see, so they get that right away. It's interesting that association comes through really quickly and strongly.
Thank you. Yes.
So this question maybe takes it in a little bit of a different direction, and I'm trying to be nice to two of my students who are here. Because we have this class, and I found a bunch of different events at St. Kate's during the first half of the semester, and I am asking people signed up for certain ones, and a couple of people signed up for this one, and they have to try to connect it back to the class. And so I thought I would tell you the class. See if you could give them a couple of hints.
I will try.
Okay, so it's Foundations in Women's Studies, so it's Women's and Gender Studies, and when I look at this, it's like, well, I was thinking, women in textile, vulnerability and gender identity, but then I thought, you're not really doing, like, I think you're doing something that's more, that's not identity bound. That's what I think, but, do you have any hints for that?
As far as the
How
relating
would they
to the
link
title.
it back? Like, cause there's an easy one that they could do, which is like, St. Kate's Gallery is bringing in a lot of women artists. Like, we could do a thing like that. But it's like, in your work, it looks like you're not doing an identity thing.
I would agree with that. When I make work, I definitely have specific experiences of my own in mind that are a jumping off point for the work. But I like to have my work speak more broadly, so I typically don't share those specific experiences. Because I hope that people can come from a different direction and maybe relate it to something in their own life. And so, yeah, for me, this is not an identity piece. I think, could someone come to it and say, well, pink is often stereotypically used for women. Does this talk about how women are subject to, a different set of restrictions in the world? Could someone bring that to this? They might, based on their life experience or their particular pathway. And I guess I wouldn't want to close off that idea if that's
For anyone.
authentic, right, right,
Okay.
if that's something that resonates with someone's experience. For me, I would like this to be a bit more open and broad so that people can think, well, what are ways that I have felt confined or isolated in my own life? And yeah, and sort of have multiple pathways in, if that makes sense.
Thanks. It's got a power in that openness.
Thank you.
Do you have just like hundreds of the little pink squares?
So many. I do, and they're currently in like white kitchen trash bags in my studio. And what was that?
Waiting to become something.
Yes, and I will say I did at some point feel like I even wanted to make a couple more of these. It's not the kindest material to be putting out into the environment, and so I stopped myself at a certain point, and this work I'll take apart, store, and show again. But for now, most of those remainder pieces are in my studio, and I think what they'll probably become is stuffing for some future sculpture that has yet to be created, so watch for that. But yeah, it was, important to me that I don't put all of them into the waste stream. So, yeah, if anyone needs any packing material, I'm your person. So.
And then I have another one. Is the size of each individual like cage, is that like kind of just like the height of the pre-folded stuff, or is there like other significance to the size, or like did you play around with that, or like did this just feel like the right size?
You know, that's a really good question. So the material comes a little bit, it comes at 4 feet tall. And so I did cut it down,
Yeah.
and I can't quite remember how that came about, and why that particular choice was made. So in the end, they're not exactly cubic, they're slightly, still slightly rectangular, solid, instead of cubic. But yeah, they're definitely cut down, so they're like 27 inches tall. And yeah, I think in the end, however I got there, what I have noticed, and Nicole and I were talking about this earlier, is that the sense for me is that if I were to ball myself up in a crouch position, I might just be able to fit inside. And so it's interesting to me in terms of the relationship to my body, which is often something that kind of governs my work, like on kind of a background level in my mind, that relationship ended up very close to maybe what I could contain my body in.
I have a question about your decision to hang some of the cubes. And you partially answered it with a red cube, because it had a sense of heaviness that you want people to walk under. But precariousness is such a apparent goal in the assemblage that I'm wondering how you decided to hang some, and how you decided how many to hang.
Sure. Thanks for that question. Yeah, in this particular environment, I knew that I wanted the height of the work to be pushing the boundaries to the ceiling. And so I knew that it would for sure be 4 stories tall. And then from there, because of just the proximity of the ceiling in this particular space, it just felt like it was looking for a relationship to the ceiling, because there was, you know, only that much left to get there. So the ceiling here in these galleries is fantastic for working on the ceiling, and so I was able to just pin directly into the ceiling in a few locations, and really I was just going for an additional sense of height, but also sort of playing with, are these heavy or are these light? Kind of that, introducing that question of like, is there gravity here, or are these, you know, floating?
I have another question too.
Yeah.
So you addressed the glue issue, but when I first saw these assembled, I was really taken with your choice of pins and the reference to textiles. I mean, you could have used lots of different kinds of fasteners. And I'm just curious if you made, you know, I love the textile reference. And I wondered if that was conscious or if you just happen to have pins handy.
I think pins are in my vernacular as an artist. That's one of my go-tos, and I think that definitely comes from textiles being my first language in art. So I've used pins with some installations that I do with string and, you know, pinning into the wall and having string that drapes on pins. And so, yes, I did have pins hanging around, but I did take some time to really consider, do I want pins? And I looked at doing some other kinds of fasteners after I sort of like backed off from, okay, I have pins around, and then kind of explored, is that really what I want to use? And then at the end of the day, yeah, it felt like the right thing for this particular work. And yeah, for this one I was able to hunt down some really tiny pins that like I'd never seen before, that have these little dipped heads and that just kind of blend in. And so yeah, it ended up sort of being something that's natural for me to work with as an artist, but also something that I think kept the focus on sort of the more gestural, drawn elements, hopefully. So.
I want to just ask, I'm really curious about your personal relationship with the container and like the concept you're working with, to the extent of which like you're comfortable talking about it, since I know that you're like, this is kind of broad, so anyone can come to this. And you said that it was personal before, so I'll respect that, but I'm really curious. Like, what are you thinking about when you're cutting these, and like, what are the questions that are coming up that you're like, I need to make this thing to get it out of me?
Yeah. I will say, so often my work will have some sort of repetitive gesture in it that maybe I later start to regret. So if you take a spin through my website later, you'll see these kind of drawings with thread, and you know, that would be another example of something with a gesture repeated over and over. And that just seems to be something that is part of a process that for me is meditative in some way, and that allows a work to evolve over time through that gesture. So I think that was somewhat inescapable for me. But yeah, regarding the cage and sort of why all of these, I think that part of what I was experiencing at the time was this idea that we were all going through some forms of loss and grief, but we were all being asked to do it, you know, in our separate spaces, you know, or our separate Zoom boxes, and really sort of partitioned off from one another. And so, you know, whereas before maybe one of my containments was large, you know, to fit more than one person, like these are very much like at most you could fit one person in it. And so yeah, I think it's really it really came down to that sense of isolation that I was experiencing like I had never experienced before in my life.
I like that because it adds an element to how they're playing together. There's a new weight to it. Because there are so many, and they are touching each other, so it's a very particular way. The precarity you were talking about is really making a lot of sense to me right now. Like outside of just like, this is how they are placed in the gallery. So, thanks.
Thank you for that question. I appreciate that. Anything else?
I have one other question. I do love how they reference textiles, and I am gonna see textiles where they don't exist. But, I think they intend to exist here. And one of the things that I know about you, Sarah, is how wonderfully precise and, intentful, I don't know if that's a word, intention prone you are. And part of what I think is really interesting about the cages or boxes, whatever you wanna call them, is the irregularity of the line. And I think it's hard for you to not make a straight line, or at least I think of you as a person who makes a straight line before you make a wiggly line. And cause I think that that's kind of who you are, you're like a straight line person. And you're not messy, I don't think. But, I'm wondering and am attracted to the irregularity of the line as you, you know, were using your X-Acto knife. And I'm wondering how much you had to really think about that, or you just sort of let the knife go a little crooked, or, and there's a certain precision I see in the exactitude of each square. Like, there seems to be a repetition of the squiggliness, which really makes it feel more like a thread. But anyway, I was wondering how that was for you as you were actually using the X-Acto knife, if you were struggling to not make it straight, or what that process was.
Thank you for your question, and that's something actually I meant to touch on earlier, because I do think that this work feels maybe more crisp or more precise than some of my previous work. Like, I love to like tear fabric and let threads hang and sort of have that raw gesture on display. This work, I think, feels tighter and more literally knife's edge. And I think for me, that wandering with the X-Acto knife, that was a way to, how would I say, that part wasn't difficult. Like, I set up a framework and I said, okay, I'm gonna do 8 across and 7 down, and I didn't have a template, and you'll see some in there like, oh, she almost didn't make it. You know, that feels like, wow, those last 2 rows are kind of weird. Or, you know, some of them have that sort of regularity. In fact, I had more than one. I've had several questions about like, did you have a template? Are these 3D printed? Kind of what's the story? So I'm aware that they give off like a very precise vibe. I don't think I will always have this precise vibe. to this degree in my work. I think, you know, for me anyway, the impulse during the, you know, early days of the pandemic was really like a sense of, a heightened sense of looking for safety or control in an environment where there was really hardly any to be found. And so, at first I was really like curious, like, do I need to like further destroy this work to sort of fight against that precision? But in the end, I wanted to let it stand because it's really a reflection of the time that it was created in. And so kind of that context, I think, pushed that even more to the fore in my work, if that makes sense. Well, thank you all so much for all of your great questions. And I'll definitely be available. I'll pop into the gallery afterward if anyone has any other questions that you would like to follow up with. So thank you so much for coming out.
Thanks, Sarah.